IB Bio, Animal Physiology, Topic 11, Part 3, Movement A, will have its focus on the way in which bones and muscles create movement in mammals and insects, after I provide a brief introduction to the topic. Movement B will focus on the detailed anatomy of muscles, while C will look at the way in which muscles function, muscle physiology. The essential idea is the roles of the musculoskeletal system are movement, support, and protection. Here is the outline of all the available movies for Topic 11. Use this outline to find the movie you need for review. This movie is focused here. Here are the first two IB syllabus statements of the movie. Bones and exoskeletons provide anchorage for muscles and act as levers. Movement of the body requires muscles to work in antagonistic pairs. The skeleton of an animal has various functions: support of the body, maintaining an upright posture, motion, movement, protection, consider how the skull protects the brain, and the rib cage protects internal organs. As well, the skeleton plays a role in blood cell production. The marrow of long bones has stem cells ready to form various blood cell types, red and white. And lastly, the skeleton plays a role as a source of calcium. The evolutionarily derived form of the skeleton is much like a cantilever bridge. The skeletal system provides support. As well, muscles are anchored to bones, providing for movement of the organism. The weight of the body hangs from the skeleton, providing support and posture. Muscles are anchored to the bones across joints, such that muscle contraction can cause movement. Stay tuned to see how it all works. Arthropods, insects, crustaceans, and arachnids have an exoskeleton. An exoskeleton is a hard outer covering that provides for protection and movement. However, an exoskeleton does not grow with the animal. Thus, the animal must periodically shed the exoskeleton and grow a new, larger exoskeleton. You can see in this photo on the left, the cicada is shedding the exoskeleton that is too small. The animal will grow another exoskeleton relatively rapidly, because without an exoskeleton, it is more vulnerable to predators. Now, vertebrates such as mammals, reptiles, amphibians, birds, and fishes have an endoskeleton. An endoskeleton is an internal structure that provides for protection and movement. The endoskeleton grows with the animal. This movie has its focus on muscles that, along with bones, create movement. Muscle tissue is a group of similar cells working together to perform a common function. Muscle tissue functions to provide motion, posture, support, and heat. Now, there are three types of muscle tissue: skeletal, cardiac, and smooth. And in each of these images, you can see individual muscle cells known as fibers. Keep this in mind. Smooth muscle is the muscle found around our internal organs, such as the digestive tract. And this is an individual cell known as a fiber. Cardiac muscle is found in the heart. An individual cardiac cell is branched, making it a little bit more difficult to discern a single cell. Skeletal muscle cell is a fiber, a single cell seen here. It's very long and slender and multinucleate. Skeletal muscle is typically anchored to bones and provides for movement. This is a single cell known as a muscle fiber. In this diagram, notice that cardiac muscle and skeletal muscle have a striped pattern. These stripes are known as striations. Striations are important in understanding muscle function, and more on striations in movies parts B and C on movement. In the diagram, you can see the branching nature of the cardiac muscle. You can see that skeletal muscle is multinucleate. Each cell has more than one nucleus. As well, skeletal muscle has a specialized endoplasmic reticulum known as sarcoplasmic reticulum. More on this in part B and C. I'm introducing some vocabulary here. Once again, notice the use of fiber to represent one cell. A muscle cell is called a fiber. Muscles are much like nerve cells. They are irritable in that they can respond to a stimulus. They are contractible. Muscles actively shorten in length. ATP is required. And muscles are elastic. Muscles return to their original length as they are extended by the contraction of a second muscle known as an antagonistic muscle. I've already shown you these two IB syllabus statements, but I'm going to dig in a bit more on both, particularly the idea of muscles acting as levers and muscles working in antagonistic pairs. As I move along, pay attention to how muscles are anchored to the bones to provide motion. Joints are where two bones are articulated together, and the anchoring of muscles across a joint is the key aspect of motion. First, you need to know that muscles actively shorten in length relative to their relaxed condition. The change in length is measurable. And secondly, muscles are anchored to bones by tendons, and this allows the muscle to pull on the bone as it contracts. Here is a diagram of a muscle running along the back of your neck, anchored to the skull and to your spine. When the muscle contracts, it pulls on the skull and your head rocks back. Now, levers are defined by the position of the applied force, the fulcrum, which is where a joint would be located, where bones are articulated together, and the resistance force, or the weight that must be lifted as a part of movement. Now, this is an example of a first-class lever, just like a seesaw, as the applied force is located here on one side of the fulcrum, while the resistance force is on the other side of the fulcrum. The fulcrum, in the middle for a first-class lever, is the joint where the skull and spine articulate. Now, the applied force is the contraction of the muscle. The fulcrum is the joint where bones are articulated, where the spinal column meets the skull, and the resistance is the forward part of the skull, the weight of the head forward of where the spinal column meets the skull. The movement associated with the forearm is a third-class lever because the fulcrum is here, while the applied force here, muscle contraction, lies between the fulcrum and the resistance force. The applied force in the case of the forearm is the contraction of the biceps. The resistance force is the weight of the lower forearm. The fulcrum here, again, that lies outside the applied force, is where the humerus bone articulates with the ulna. Now, don't worry about the names of bones now. I'm just layering in some vocabulary to be seen later in the movie. Here is a nice image of the forearm of a mammal. It's a third-class lever because the fulcrum is here, the applied force, the contraction of the biceps, is here, and the resistance force, or load, is here. Notice how the biceps is anchored. One insertion point of the muscle is the upper arm bone known as the humerus, and the other insertion point is the radius of the forearm. The biceps muscle lies across the elbow joint. This is the way muscles affect motion. Pay close attention to this idea. Here is a slide that compares the three lever types. I've already introduced you to the first-class lever, where the fulcrum lies in the middle between the applied force, labeled E for effort, and the resistance force. I've already introduced you to the third-class lever, where the applied force E is in the middle between the fulcrum and the resistance force. The last lever type, the second-class lever, has a resistance force in the middle between the fulcrum and the applied force. Now you can see the example of a second-class lever in the body of a mammal. As a quick note, third-class levers are the more common type of lever in the human body because it provides for a wider range of motion than other types of levers. I'm not going to go into an explanation of this point. Here is a nice slide that compares the three types of levers, first, second, and third, with an example of each in the body. In this slide, you can see the position of the three components, the fulcrum, applied force, which is the muscle action, and the resistance or load, what needs to be lifted. In first-class levers, the fulcrum lies between the applied force and the resistance. In second-class levers, the resistance force, what needs to be lifted, lies between the fulcrum and the applied force, muscle action. In third-class levers, the applied force lies between the fulcrum and the load. Study this slide to gain control of the material. This slide should feel familiar. As a third-class lever, the fulcrum, the applied force, muscle contraction, and the load or resistance. Now I'm transitioning to look at muscle contraction across a joint involving antagonistic pairs of muscles. Now you can easily see how the biceps would contract, shorten, to bring the forearm up, lift this ball up. The biceps is the flexor muscle as it brings the forearm in toward the body. Fine, but how does the forearm come down? How does it extend? Does gravity play a role? Yes, but movement involves antagonistic pairs of muscles. And in this image, the antagonist to the biceps is not shown. The antagonist to the biceps is the triceps, located here, and the triceps is the extensor as it brings the forearm down. Here is the elbow joint. The biceps is the flexor, bringing the forearm closer to the body. The triceps, inserted on the ulna below the elbow joint, contracts and pulls the forearm down. The triceps is the extensor. Here is a nice schematic image of the human forearm on the left. You can see how the biceps would contract to pull or flex the arm up. You can see how the triceps would contract to extend the arm down. You might remember that I mentioned that muscles actively contract but do not actively extend. Once a muscle contracts, it is the contraction of the antagonist muscle that extends the contracted muscle back to its original length. Now I cannot leave this slide without mentioning the insect leg seen on the right. Muscles lie within the exoskeleton but operate in exactly the same way as I've already described. Muscles are inserted along the inside walls of the exoskeleton. Flexors bring legs toward the body, while extensor muscles extend legs away from the body. Antagonist muscle pairs, exist in arthropods just like mammals. Hopefully you feel comfortable with these IB syllabus statements before I move on to look specifically at the anatomy of the elbow. In case you need to review the movement of an insect leg, you can study this slide. Muscles lie within the exoskeleton but operate in exactly the same way as I've described with mammals. Muscles are inserted along the inside walls of the exoskeleton. The flexor brings the leg toward the body, while the extensor extends the leg away from the body. Antagonist muscle pairs exist in arthropods as well. This slide nicely shows the action of antagonistic pairs of muscles. As the biceps contracts, the triceps relaxes and extends passively. The arm flexes. As the triceps contracts, the biceps relaxes and extends passively, and the arm extends. You can study a similar action of flexor and extensor muscles in the insect leg. Let's move on to look at the elbow in more detail. Here's the IB syllabus statement. Annotate a diagram of the human elbow joint. Include cartilage, synovial fluid, joint capsule, humerus, ulna, radius, biceps, and triceps. Let's start with the muscles and bones, and we'll get to the synovial joint a bit later. In this image, you can see the following structures. The bone of the upper arm is known as the humerus. The forearm has two bones, the radius and the ulna. The biceps is here. It's inserted on the radius and over the head of the humerus to the scapula. And the triceps is here, and it's inserted on the ulna and on to the scapula. Notice how both muscles extend across the elbow joint, across the elbow joint, across the elbow joint. The shoulder joint is a ball and socket joint. The elbow is known as a hinge joint. More on joint types later in the movie. At this point, you should already be able to state the functions. The biceps flexes the forearm. The triceps extends the forearm. The humerus is articulated with the ulna and the radius and provides a joint that allows motion when muscles that lie across the joint contract. The radius rotates slightly, providing some rotational motion of the lower forearm. The ball and socket joint of the humerus with the scapula allows rotation in many directions. The elbow, just like the knee, is a synovial joint, and here is a generalized synovial joint with a capsule filled with fluid. The fluid protects the ends of the bones from shock of movement. Cartilage lines the ends of the bones as they articulate in the joint. The fluid, in conjunction with the cartilage, lubricates the joint, providing for a smooth articulation, reducing the friction that would exist as bones rub against each other during motion. Here's another image of a synovial joint. It's on the right side of this image. You can see the capsule with the fluid enclosed within. The bones that articulate at a joint are held together by ligaments, as can be seen here, and the elbow is a synovial joint. Here is an X-ray of an elbow joint with the humerus, the ulna, and the radius all properly identified. Here's a chance to review all of the structures associated with the elbow joint. You can turn the movie off now or follow along with me. A is the humerus, the upper arm bone. B is the triceps muscle, the extensor, extending the forearm. You can see the capsule membrane here. C is the synovial capsule with the synovial fluid. D is the cartilage that lines the ends of the bones. The synovial fluid and the cartilage reduce the friction that occurs when bones articulate against one another during motion. E is the ulna, one of the two lower arm bones. F is the radius, the other lower arm bone that allows for rotation of the lower arm. G is the tendon that attaches the biceps muscle to the bone. H is the ligament that attaches bone to bone. And I, the biceps muscle, is the flexor, bringing the forearm closer to the body. In this image of an elbow joint, you can see tendons here and here that attach muscle to bone, muscle to bone. The biceps has a tendon that attaches the biceps to the radius, and the triceps has a tendon that attaches the triceps to the ulna. Ligaments connect bone to bone in order to stabilize the joint. A ligament is seen here, connecting the humerus to the radius. Ligaments hold together the bones that articulate at a joint. This slide and the last one are good slides to study. I've covered this IB syllabus statement through the last 20 slides. State the role of muscles, ligaments, tendons, and bones in producing movement or locomotion. Here are the roles of muscles, ligaments, tendons, and bones in writing. You can study this slide on your own. In this slide, you can see an X-ray and an illustration of an elbow joint. I mentioned earlier that the elbow joint is a hinge joint. Hinge joints allow movement in a single plane. Flex, extend, nothing more. So that brings us to the next and last IB syllabus statements. State that synovial joints allow certain movements but not others. Describe the motion of the following joints as representative synovial joints: hinge, ball and socket, pivot, and saddle. The femur is the long bone of the lower leg. The head of the femur is a ball, and it articulates in a socket in the hip bone. The ball and socket joint of the femur and hip allows motion in more than one plane. On the left, we have a schematic of a ball and socket joint that shows rotation in multiple planes. On the right is an X-ray of the hip joint. Here's a nice image of the head of a femur forming a ball and socket joint with the pelvis. The marrow of long bones is where blood cells are formed. The marrow has stem cells ready to differentiate into different types of blood cells. The shoulder joint is also a ball and socket joint, rotation in many planes. You can see an illustration of the shoulder joint on the left and an X-ray on the right. The knee joint, like the elbow joint, is a hinge joint, as its motion occurs in a single plane. In the X-ray on the left, we can see the femur and the two lower leg bones, the tibia and the fibula. In the illustration on the right, we can see the femur is articulated with the tibia. We can see cartilage, we can see ligaments, and we can see muscle and tendons. It's important to note that hinge joints and ball and socket joints are synovial joints. Here is another image of the knee joint where the femur articulates with the tibia, and this is a hinge joint. Motion in one plane. Flex, extend, nothing more. The knee joint and the elbow joint are both synovial joints. A pivot joint is typical of the joint connecting the radius to the humerus in the upper forearm, and it allows rotational movement. The pivot joint is also synovial. The saddle joint allows movements in two planes only, back and forth, side to side. The saddle joint is synovial, and it is the capsule that pops when people pull hard on their fingers. Some people enjoy cracking their knuckles, as it's called. The elbow joint, a hinge joint, is synovial, as is the ball and socket joint, which allows rotation in many planes. Sutures of the skull and gliding joints are not synovial joints. Here are additional images of a ball and socket joint, a hinge joint, and a pivot joint. I'll let you study this slide on your own. As I bring this movie to an end, and I anticipate Topic 11 Part 4, Movement B, I want to remind you that we will focus on skeletal muscle. Skeletal muscle cells, fibers, are multinucleate and contain specialized endoplasmic reticulum called sarcoplasmic reticulum. Skeletal muscle has a striped pattern. These stripes are known as striations. Striations are important in understanding muscle function. In this image, we can see some detail that foreshadows Topic 11 Part 4, Movement B. A muscle has been sliced in cross-section and angled toward us to show that muscle is composed of bundles within which are many fibers. Each fiber is one cell. This is a single muscle cell, and it's quite long. If you're going to be a structure that contracts, shortens, you need to be long in the first place. This is a structure-function relationship. Here is another image of muscle in cross-section. Here is the bundle, and here is the fiber. Notice the striations on the fiber, the one cell. Within the long cell are protein filaments that are packed into groups known as myofibrils. Let's move on to Part 4, Movement B, to better understand muscle cell anatomy, including all the vocabulary that's involved. And that brings us to the end of IB Bio Animal Physiology, Topic 11, Part 3, Movement A.